Now let's talk about the costs of when people don't do human systems engineering or human factors correctly. So you can imagine with products that are difficult to use, even dangerous, for example, there's decreased sales and satisfaction, so you're not making as much money in your company. There's a decreased willingness to repurchase. So if you try something once and it doesn't, really work very well, then chances are you're not going to go back and buy it again. And instead, you're kind of going to badmouth your product. There's this notion of what people sometimes call brand terrorists. The idea behind a brand terrorist is they have some bad interaction with your product or your offer, and they make sure everybody knows about it by poor word of mouth. They'll do this now, especially with all kinds of social media and review sites. And this makes it terribly difficult for you to do business and do good business and have a good reputation. So it results in all kinds of poor product reviews. I mean, this started years and years ago with just sort of trade magazines where people would review products that are out there. Now there's just an endless supply of websites that do exactly that. So if you're going to design a product, then you're going to want it to be as easy to use as it possibly can be, or else you're going to pay a price. And that's happening more and more. If you're going to make something as easy to use as it can be, then you're going to have to know an awful lot about how people behave, what their limitations and what their capabilities are. So another consequence of sort of poor human factors is lost productivity. So it takes a long time for a difficult product to sort of learn how to use the system. You end up doing tasks in kind of inefficient ways. So if you have a new rollout of a product, an internal product for your company that enables you to do, bookkeeping or time management or something like that, and it's not particularly easy to use, then now you have a whole company that's sort of wasting your money by doing things in inefficient ways, all because the system is difficult to use. Moreover, sometimes people make errors as a result of poor design, and fixing those errors can take an awfully long time, especially if those errors have resulted in the loss of data somehow. Further, people sometimes will not adopt products. That is, they'll just choose not to even use a product rather than go through the hassle of using something that's difficult to use. Further, just the loss in employee satisfaction, if you have them use a product that they really don't want to, can result in things like employee turnover. And employee turnover is incredibly expensive. So imagine you had a pretty good employee and they just move on because they're so fed up with using systems like the one that they're using on a day-to-day basis. Replacing them costs about 1.5 times their annual salary. That is, finding the right person, bringing them in, interviewing them, hiring them, getting them trained up, getting them used to the new systems, all of that kind of stuff is terribly expensive. Further, there's increased maintenance costs when you design something that's not easy to use. Typically, 80% of the costs of developing software occur during the maintenance phase, not during the software development phase, but during the maintenance phase as people are fixing bugs, people are, spending time sort of talking through how to use the system on a 1-800 number or something of that sort. It's the case that a cost of a change early on in development is a lot cheaper than the cost of a change later on in development, even after delivery. So this gives us an idea of what poor human factors really amounts to. So here's an example of why human factors needs to be involved early on in the design process. So imagine this is sort of a project life cycle. During the definition phase, when you're just sort of entertaining what it is you're going to create, what characteristics it's going to have, what features and functions it'll have, and so forth, the cost of any change is actually very, very low. On the other hand, as you move throughout the design of the product, each change gets more and more expensive. So much so that it's something like 60 times the price to make a change at this phase close to release than it is at this phase during definition. There's other problems with poor human factors. So, for example, there's increased litigation and liability. In fact, there's whole law firms and consultancies, sizable ones, that exist just looking at human factors liability. There's an increase in human tragedy. So, for example, in 1999, the Institute of Medicine came out with a report that conservatively estimated that between 44,000 and 98,000 preventable hospital deaths occurred annually every year. And a large part of those had to do with poor design and poor human factors. In other words, products that were not designed to match the people that were using the product. If this was the same as in aviation, that would be like a wide-body jet crashing every day or two in the United States. And even the low cost would be 8th leading cause of death in the United States, more than AIDS, breast cancer, traffic accidents, and the like. Yet we don't hear about it as often as we should. And in fact, recent studies, 2015 rather than 2000, suggest that the frequency of these things may be about 4 times. So it could be 200,000 to 400,000 or so deaths occurring probably needlessly in the U.S. due to preventable medical error, basically. Here's an example of this. I thought it would be helpful to walk through one example. So this person is named Robin Rogers. She was 35 weeks pregnant, and she was vomiting and losing weight. Her doctor hospitalized her and ordered that she be fed through a tube until the birth of her daughter, which should only be a few more weeks after that. Unfortunately, the hospital mixed up 2 tubes. Instead of snaking a tube through Mrs. Rogers' nose and into her stomach, the nurse coupled the liquid food bag to a tube that entered a vein. So what should have been going in through her stomach was actually going into her bloodstream. This is like pouring concrete down a drain, and she and her baby both died. The problem is that patients have lots of clear plastic tubes, and because it's cost effective and flexible, frankly, they use them for many different things. They use them the same tubes, more or less, to deliver medicine, nutrition, fluids, gases or blood, etc. But unfortunately, it sometimes goes in the wrong place. The tubing's interchangeable, and nurses connect and disconnect dozens of these things every day. And anytime you're doing dozens of things a day, eventually you're going to make a mistake. A simple misconnection between these 2 things could lead to death. So this has happened in numerous cases. Tubes intended to inflate blood pressure cuffs, for example, pumping lots of air into a cuff, get connected to intravenous lines, leading to air embolisms in people's bloodstreams. Another is intravenous fluids get connected to tubes intended to deliver oxygen. So now you got fluids going into people's lungs, leading to suffocation. Here's another example. These I refer to as the vincristine errors. They were reported in a nice book called The Human Factor by a fellow named Kim Vicente. He's a professor up at University of Toronto, I believe. But a boy, Ryan Bishop, from Thunder Bay, Ontario, was diagnosed with leukemia. And he was treated, as people often are, with chemotherapy for 3 years. After those 3 years, he received his second to last treatment. Thankfully, his leukemia was in remission for 2 years. But the doctors continued treatment to be on the safe side and so forth. And on his way home from treatment, he felt ill. The next day, his condition was even worse. Here's what happened. Ryan had been given a drug called vincristine. This is a drug often used to treat childhood leukemia. Vincristine should only be given intravenously, that is by IV. They also gave him a drug called methotrexate at the same time. This drug should only be given IT, what's called intrathecally or a spinal injection. Unfortunately, the doctor mistakenly gave both of the drugs intrathecally, that is by spinal injection. The problem is that when vincristine's given by IT, it destroys the nervous system, and Ryan died at 8 years old. So, his family did not sue the hospital, actually, but they did make a deal with the hospital and with various groups in Canada to talk about how do we fix this so this never happens again. So some things they came up with would be that drug packages should be clearly labeled and color-coded for whether it's an IV drug or an IT drug. Syringes should be similarly labeled for either IT or IV drug. IV and IT drugs should never be in the same room at the same time. And to make sure this didn't happen elsewhere in Canada, they made sure to publicize this all around. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite enough. Two-year-old Courtney Brond of Nova Scotia was diagnosed with leukemia. Sounds familiar. 1 year later, treated with these same two drugs. After 2 years, her cancer went into remission. As she was receiving her last treatment, her regular doctor was busy that day, so another doctor filled in, and he mistakenly delivered both drugs, IT. She died 2 days later at 4 years old. She no longer had leukemia, but had died from this medical error instead. 2 years after that, 4-year-old Christine Walker of British Columbia was diagnosed with leukemia, completed 2 years of chemotherapy, went into remission. After that, the cancer showed up again, or showed some signs of returning, so the doctors planned another round of chemo. She was given both vincristine and methotrexate by IT, and she died at 7 years old. So these sort of point out problems that are not necessarily problems where people were trying to cause harm, but problems where people make mistakes. And people sometimes make mistakes because they get confused about things like how should things be given, IT or IV. And in fact, when they talked to the doctors and nurses surrounding this, typically they said things like, well, we already had a spinal injection going. I didn't want to poke them with another needle because that's painful and they're kids. So I just figured I'd give both drugs through that way. So they were actually trying to do something good often, but it turned out that it had pretty horrible effects. Here's another example. You might know the actor Dennis Quaid. Well, Dennis and his wife had twins some time back. It's been quite a while now. So here it is. They were born in 2007. The twins, Thomas and Zoe, because they were born prematurely, went to the neonatal intensive care unit, and they were given 2 adult doses of heparin. Heparin is a drug that's used to reduce clotting, and it's basically given so that once you have an IV in the baby or in the person, that that IV doesn't clot up, and you can continue to get fluids into the patient. Well, in this particular case, they were given 2 adult doses of heparin instead of 2 child doses or infant doses. And that was 1,000 times stronger than what they should have been given. So you can see that over here. They should be taking this particular dose, which is 10 units per milliliter, and instead we're given this dose, 10,000 units per milliliter. So that basically was 1,000 times stronger than what they should have been given. Because the nurse failed to detect the dosage on the bottle, the infants received 10,000 units rather than 10, turning their blood into the consistency of water. A similar case happened a year earlier, and 3 babies died in a pharmacy after a pharmacy technician put adult doses of heparin in cabinets used by the neonatal intensive care unit. So if you look at this, you can see why this might have occurred. The lab tech, or the pharmacy tech, I should say, who supplied these, looked at both of these things, and they're actually pretty similar, right? And that's true of lots of branding. Lots of times you want your products to look similar to each other, but in some cases, products that look similar to each other can actually be dangerous, for example, in this case. Now, of course, this never should have happened, but it's often the case that people make mistakes. And in order to design well and to reduce the mistakes people make, we sometimes need to make things easy to discriminate from each other. And of course, that's afterwards what the company Baxter, who manufactured this, did. I think I told you about that one. The problem with this in medicine is that a lot of these problems go underreported. The University of Texas found that on average only 5 adverse drug reactions were reported in a particular hospital with 900 beds one year, but when they went through the actual medical records, they found an average of 240 adverse reactions, not 5. So this is a reporting rate of only 2%, and the actual rate was probably 50 times higher than the actual or the reported rate. So there are some reasons that we have bad design. We have poor human factors. Sometimes it's that there's not really policy from management that human factors or human systems engineering has strategic importance. Instead, they're working so hard on the technological aspects, getting the product to work, that they don't focus as much on getting the product to work well for humans using it. We still have this tendency to emphasize technology instead of the user. And of course, the user is the one who has the technology in their hands, so we need to know about how the user works. The product sometimes doesn't fit how the user works, and sometimes we lack knowledge of our users and their tasks, and that contributes to poor design as well. Sometimes we make unrealistic assumptions about people and create a bad fit between those people and the technology, and then we go further and blame the people who are trying to use it for the bad human error or the poor results. So the idea is design needs to include this knowledge of people, and the human sciences have an impressive knowledge about the physiology and psychology of humans. Now it's just a matter of taking that knowledge and applying it to design.